This tutorial explains how to use the exception data window. The exception data window displays detailed information about each exception from an inspection. The column on the left displays all of the exceptions, grouped by the accelerometer that generated the exception. Manual exceptions are listed at the bottom of the column. Click on any exception in this column to get detailed information about that exception in the data grid on the right. The first section of the data grid provides summary data about the exception ID, and the date and time the exception occurred. The second section of the data grid provides details about the exception, including where the accelerometer was located, the performance standard, axis, and threshold against which the exception was generated, the acceleration trigger level of the exception, the maximum value in g of the acceleration during the exception, and the duration in milliseconds of the exception. The third section of the data grid provides details about the location of the exception, including the distance to the nearest milepost, the speed, latitude, longitude, and altitude of the vehicle when the exception occurred, and whether or not the GPS had a valid fix when the exception occurred. Additionally, if you have an internet connection, you can click the word location, and your default browser will appear with the exception location in Google Maps. The final section of the data grid is the memo section. In this section, you can view information about the exception for documentation and reporting purposes. The exception data window has three buttons: Snap, Memo, and Delete. Clicking on Snap will focus all three data windows, GPS, accelerometer, and exception, to that exception's time and position. Clicking on Memo will display an editable text box for adding or modifying the memo of an exception. With regards to the Delete button, only manual exceptions can be deleted. Select a manual exception and click on the Delete button. When prompted, "Are you sure you want to delete this manual exception?" click Yes. The first toolbar above the GPS data window can be used to manipulate the view of the exception data window. This toolbar toggles exception data by accelerometer. Each accelerometer is assigned a specific color. For example, clicking on the cyan icon, the color designated for accelerometer 1001, and selecting None, removes those accelerometer's exceptions from all of the data windows, including the exception data window. Clicking on the cyan icon and selecting the performance standard adds the accelerometer's exceptions back into the data window. Clicking on the yellow icon, the color designated for manual exceptions, toggles the visibility of all the manual exceptions in all of the data windows, including the exception data window.